Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome back to another Docker Compose tutorial. In this tutorial series, I've already shown you how to configure a Postgres database or containerize a Postgres database. We're going to take that a little bit further in this tutorial because I did miss a few points here. One being also creating or configuring a way of managing our database. In this case, we're going to be utilizing pgAdmin. So we're going to spin up a separate container for pgAdmin, and from there we're going to be able to, utilizing a web interface, administrate our Postgres database. This does present an opportunity to go through some of the basic setups if we wanted to customize our network and assign custom IP addresses to containers. So we'll go through the basics of that and set up an IP address for our Postgres and pgAdmin container. So this is a visual representation of what we're trying to achieve in this tutorial. We're assuming that we're working locally with Django. We might be working on multiple Django applications. So here we can set up Postgres and pgAdmin in actual fact for multiple Django applications. Of course, the benefit here of utilizing Docker is that we don't have to go through the process of installing applications on our operating system. So this is OS independent, so this setup could work on Mac, Linux, or Windows, as long as you've got Docker installed. So here on the left-hand side, you can see we're going to install Django, and then we're going to set up a volume for both the database and pgAdmin so that we can save and persist our data should our containers fail or get deleted, for example. And over the right-hand side here, you can see the setup we're going to go for with the IP addresses. So we're going to set up a network 192.168.0.0. And then we're going to go ahead and assign the Postgres database to 0.2 and the pgAdmin to 0.3. And that's really useful because what this allows us to do is when we set up the pgAdmin, we configure that to connect to Postgres. We know that we're going to have a consistent environment, and the Postgres database is always going to be on 0.2 IP address, and pgAdmin is always going to be on 0.3. In addition to that, the default ports for Postgres database is going to be 5432, and pgAdmin is going to be port 80. So we're going to need to map across from our local machine to these ports so that we can access within the containers these separate services. Let's get set up with Visual Studio Code. I've already started, created a folder, and now I just need to install Django. Of course, if you are familiar with this, you can skip this in the timeline and head over to the next section. So I'll press Control and comma, bring up the terminal. Let's go ahead and utilize Python. First of all, we'll create a virtual environment, of course. So venv, and then a folder called venv. So that's going to create a new virtual environment. I'm going to prepare my command. Okay, so tab /s tab /a. Let's get the virtual machine activated, and then I'll go ahead and pip install Django. Once we've done this, we just need to create a new Django application. So Django Django-admin space, and then we'll go ahead and start a project, and we'll just call this core space and then dot. So that's going to create a new folder, and there we go. So that's all now set up. So we're going to create a new Docker Compose file. So let's create a new Docker Compose file. Here we're going to describe the services that we want to set up. In this case, we want to set up our database and also the admin tool. So this is going to be a YAML file. Right, so with that in place, now the first thing we may as well, while we're here, we're going to be utilizing a Postgres database. So in order for Django to connect to that, we're going to need the management tool for that. So let's go ahead and pip install the psycobg2 package. Okay, there we go. So that's that installed. And then of course you can just pip freeze if you like. Let's just create a requirements text file. There we go. So that's now installed. And If you're new to Postgres database, I do apologize. This is I've described it as a management tool. So Django needs to know how to interact with a Postgres database. This package is going to provide those instructions, if you like, to allow Django to connect to Postgres and work with Postgres database. Okay, so let's go ahead and now set up our two services. So in Docker Compose file here, we're going to just first of all identify the version we're going to be utilizing here. Identifying, if you're again new here, identifying the version of Docker that our text now or instructions correspond to. Of course, as the versions progress, some of this code might be retired, so it may not work with different versions. So we're going to now describe the services. So first of all, the database. So we're going to need, we can provide a container name if we want to. So I've just called this PostgreSQL DB. And then the image that we want to draw down from the Docker Hub. Now, of course, there's multiple versions of Postgres that you might want to utilize based upon your specific needs. So go ahead to the Docker Hub and have a look at that. Here, I'm just going to go for the default or the latest Postgres image. And now I'm going to set up the restart always. So this is just going to, like I've left some comments here, it automatically restarts the container should the Docker daemon or restart, or should you restart the computer or the container manually, it's just going to automatically start the container. So that's restart. And then now we're going to set up the environment. So again, if you want to expand upon this, head over to the Docker Hub website, type in Postgres, go to the Postgres official image and have a look at some of the other environment variables, because there are plenty of them. Here we're just going to set up a baseline. So we're going to define the Postgres user and then the password. And then we're going to go ahead and create a Postgres database called testdb. And then we're now going to define the ports. So what we're doing here is we're just mapping across any kind of outside user trying to connect to this machine, in that case our local machine. If we then specify port 5432 and head it across to this container, then that's going to map across to the port in this container, which is running the database. So that's how we're going to build a connection from our computer, say, to the container. So this is almost a door into the container through this port, and then inside of the container, that will then provide us access to our database. So that's the database configuration at the moment that we're going to utilize. And then let's set up pgAdmin. So this is pgAdmin 4. So I've set a container name of that pgAdmin 4. So the image, so we're going to download that image and utilize that. Again, restart always, and then we'll set up some environment variables. So like all images, you can go ahead and have a look at on Docker Hub the different environment variables. There are plenty of them. Here I'm going to set up the default email, so the username and password, essentially what that is there. And then by default, pgAdmin listens to port 80. You can configure that with the pg_listen_port. If you wanted to change that, at the moment, there's no need to, because we're spinning this up in a separate container. Nothing else is running. So that doesn't seem to be a problem. So all we need to do here is just map across a port from our machine over to the port on the container so that we can access our pgAdmin interface. Right, so with that done, we're going to go ahead with this first before we add volumes, etc. So that should set us up nicely. Now I have got a nice commands list here if you would like to see this, or if you've gotten some of the commands. So docker compose up, that's basically a quick command that's going to basically, in this case, it's going to download the images for both Postgres and pgAdmin, and then it's going to go ahead and just run them straight away. So I am making the assumption that you've already downloaded Docker Desktop, for example. You've got Docker installed on your machine. Apologies, I didn't mention that earlier in the preview. So yeah, you're going to need Docker Desktop here. I'm going to predominantly use Docker Desktop to access resources. You can use the command prompt, of course. So here I've got no images at all. So what's going to happen now is that the Postgres database image and also the pgAdmin image is going to be downloaded and then started utilizing this configuration that we've set up here. So let's give that a go again, or let's give that a go, Docker compose up. So you can see that's pulling the images down. They're now downloading. So this is going to take a while because they're around about 200 meg in size. But eventually what's going to happen, of course, is your images are going to appear here. The containers are going to be started and we're going to access them from here. So just wait a couple of seconds and I'll see you back in a second. Okay, so working again in Docker desktop, you can see that we've downloaded the images. Here they are for both pgAdmin and Postgres. And if I go into my containers, you can see I've got this, got two new containers running here. So we have the pgAdmin and PostgreSQL. So that seems to be working okay. It does denote the ports running port 5050 and 5432. So that's how we're going to enter these containers. So what we can do now is let's open up a browser. So on our local machine, we're going to type in 127.0.0.1, a loopback address, and then we're going to need to also now include the port. And I can't remember what the port was. So let's have a quick look. So it's 5050. Right, so that's the port, so 5050. So that's now going to map us across now to our pgAdmin container, and you can see we're now accessing pgAdmin, and then the username was root@root.com, and then the password is root. So I can now log in. There we go. And now we're presented with a few options. So what we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to connect our pgAdmin over to our database server. So we need to add new server, give it a name. Let's just call it Django DB. And then from here, we're now going to select connection. So we now need to know what the host is, or the IP address of our database. So there's a few options here, but let's just go through one of them. So I'm just going to open up a command prompt. And then from here, I'm just going to type in docker ps. So that's going to give us a list of all the images that are currently running. And we've got a few different options here. That's been displayed, for example, ports here, the image name, etc. So what I can now do is if I do docker inspect, for example, so I can define this a little bit more specifically just to the IP address, but wanted to just use inspect and just to explore this feature. Now, all I need to do here is take one of the names. So Postgres, we need to know the IP address of that. So just D0. So I'm just typing in the first letters of this container. It's going to assume the rest of them. So if I just do that, I'm having a look at the details of this container, the Postgres container. So from here, if I browse up, there's a load of different information, but you probably already spotted it already. Down the bottom here is some IP address configurations. So what I'm looking for is the IP address of this. And you can see here it's 172.16.0.0.3. So that's the IP address, if you like, the Docker internal IP address of this resource. So let's go back into our browser, put that in, and let's just see if we can connect. So the password was root, press save, and you can see now I'm actually connected to my Django DB. So inside of here, I've got databases. Inside of here, I've got the test DB. That's a database, if you remember, that I set up in the Docker Compose configuration. And inside of here, we should have schemas. So at the moment, there isn't anything here in tables. So all of our tables will be in here. So there's nothing in here because we haven't actually built a table. So let's just showcase the fact that this is working so we can test this now. So let's go back into our Django code. Now, if we go into the core and settings, of course, in here, we have where we configure our database. So at the moment, we're just utilizing the default SQLite database. So let's go ahead now and configure a new database. So what we want here is we want to now configure our Django application to utilize the Postgres database. So the engine now is going to be the backend PostgreSQL. So this is only going to work if we install the package that we did earlier. So just make sure you've got that. Then the name. So this is the name of the database. We saw that earlier in the management tool here. It's the test_DB. So that was our database. And now we go ahead with the user and password. So root host. Now that's localhost, because remember we're going to access this through the port. So the 5432 port is going to be mapped across to that Postgres container, and we're going to now be able to access it through this port. Right, so now we've got that in place. That's pretty much all we're going to need there to configure, or sorry, to connect to our database. So let's just test this by opening up a new terminal here, and we'll run the management py file, and we'll just migrate. We'll do initial migrate, so that's going to take all the initial databases tables and set them up for our application, and you can see that's worked okay. So what we can do now is go back into our pgAdmin here, and we'll go down to schemas and then tables. We'll probably just need a refresh, and you can now see we've got access to tables, and these are of course the default tables for Django. So we can further test this, of course, so we can see some data by, let's just use the managed py file here. Let's create a super user. So let's just create a new super user, admin. There we go. And let's go back now in, and we'll just go ahead and view edit data and then all rows. So I've right clicked on the user table, view and edit all rows, and that will now display all the data inside of this table. And you can see I've got one item, and that's the admin I just created. So now we've got that basic configuration in place. Of course, what's going to happen now is if I were to delete the container, what would happen is all that configuration that we've configured on pgAdmin and the Postgres database, that would not persist. So we would now find that we're in a situation that all our data has now been deleted. So there are a few ways for us to deal with this, as we've seen in previous tutorials in this series. So what we're going to do here is just create a simple volume and map across the PostgreSQL database data like we've done before in the previous tutorials. And then we're going to create a folder in our local machine Django folder where we're going to store that data. And then in addition to that, we'll do the same thing for pgAdmin so that we don't have to, every time we run this in new containers, have to configure our pgAdmin to connect to our Postgres database. Now, one of the issues here potentially is that every time we set up this, or maybe we delete containers and set this up, or someone else sets this configuration up, it might be that our Postgres container might have a separate IP address. It might have a different IP address to the one that we've already configured in pgAdmin. So to prevent this, we can create a static IP address range for our Docker environment, and then apply IP addresses, static IP addresses, to our resources here, so that we create a persistent, consistent environment, regardless of how many times we delete containers or spin them up, etc. So let's go ahead now and just set up our volumes to map across, and then also our networks to create a consistent or persistent IP address schema. So first up then, in the database, I've set up the volume. So dot referring to this folder, our project folder. Then we're going to create a new folder called data and then db. So that's what we're going to do in this folder here, our Django folder. We're going to set up a new folder called database and then db. And we're going to map now this folder across, over to our container here, which is going to be where our Postgres database is being stored in our container. So we're going to map that data across. So that is in the folder var lib PostgreSQL data. So we're going to map that across to our local machine here. So every time we delete the container, it means that this is basically going to be mapped across when we create a new container. So our data is going to persist. So we do exactly the same thing here with pgAdmin. Set up our volume here, .data. So we're going to reuse the data folder we've created previously. This time we're going to create a new folder called pgAdmin data, and then we're just going to map across var lib pgAdmin over to this local machine. And again, that's the same type of setup here, in that we will now persist the configuration to our Postgres database. So now we're going to set up our network. So networks, so a new section here. You need to be careful to make sure that you've indented this correctly. So we have services, say, on the main indent or the zero indentation. So this needs to be, again, a new section. So this doesn't need to be indented at all. So we'll give it a name, appnet configuration. So here we're going to use the default driver, and then we can now set up a configuration. So we're going to create up a new subnet 192.168.0.0, and then we're going to have a subnet mask of 24. So there's obviously, this is a very rooted into networking. If you're not too familiar with networking, this is a class C IP address. Okay, so the first three portions here are your host, your network portion, sorry. So this utilizes 24 bits, so 8, 16, 24. So each component here consists of 8 bits, for example. So this is a 32-bit IP addressing scheme, IP version 4. So that sets up our subnet mask and our subnet for our network. So we can also set up the gateway. So this is a gateway. Think of the gateway if you're not familiar with gateways. This is the point where the network enters and exits. So this is a gateway. So if you want to exit your network, you're going to point your device to there. Similar to maybe a home environment where you've got your network at home. So your machine knows to connect to the internet through the gateway, which is normally in or on your router. So all data is pointed towards that gateway so it can exit your network and go onto the internet and then come back and so on. So that's our gateway. So now we've set up our network configuration. We now need to apply that or assign IP addresses to each of our containers here. So let's first of all add the settings in our Postgres or database section. So we're going to reference via appnet. Okay, so I'll paste that in. So networks, here we go, appnet, and then IP version 4 address. So we're going to assign this database to 192.168.0.1. Now, 2, sorry. So not 1, of course. We can't utilize 1 again because that's the gateway address. So this time we give it IP address 2. So we can do the same thing again here for our pgAdmin. So just make sure that everything is lined up here, indented correctly. So with ports, and this time we're going to give this an IP address of 3. So that's it really. I know I haven't explained some of these other items. Have a look at the documentation. For this particular tutorial, there's probably no need for us to go into this level of detail. We just want to get this working, a baseline configuration. So there are obviously multiple options that we can configure in the networks, and there's a few pages, no doubt, going through those different options in Docker documentation. But this is a simple configuration, and our key information here is configuring this subnet, and understanding the subnet is obviously going to be important here, and the gateway, which is not massively important at this point, but I just wanted to explain that fact. And then now we've just set up via the name reference appnet, we've now set up an IP address for both components here, 02 and 03. And of course, IP addresses, if you're new to IP addresses, they have to be unique. Now we are using a class C IP address, so it's important to make sure that the first 3 numbers are exactly the same on all of our resources here. And then the fourth number here is unique. So we have a unique number here for the database container, the pgAdmin, and then of course the gateway. So 0 here being basically, this is like a reference point to this network. So our network is 0.192.168.0.0. So if you think about if you do have in your country like a local numbering system, if I wanted to telephone someone on a kind of a local number, first of all, I would type in kind of the network number. So 0463, for example, and then I'd type in the personal IP address. So it's kind of the same thing here in that the network portion, that directs data to that particular network. There might be multiple of them. And then the last number will direct it to the individual machine or resource. So let's just go ahead and just remove everything we've done so far. So that just removes. So you can keep the images in place. And that's not a problem at all. There's no point removing those. So just the containers. So let's go ahead now. And again, just go ahead and Docker compose and then up. So let's just rebuild utilizing our new configuration. So straight away, you can see that we now have a new folder called data, We have DB for the database data, pgAdmin for the pgAdmin data. So let's go in and access this again. So it's going to probably ask us to log in again. Going to give that a few seconds. Let's just go for the main. Let's leave that. So maybe our container isn't up yet. Oh, okay. There we go. Now it started. Right. So root at root.com and the password of root. So let's log in. Oh, okay. Let's probably just need to refresh. That's why it's coming up with the CSRF token. There we go. Okay, so now we need to add the server again. So we now know the server is on a different IP address, of course. Django. So we need to select the IP address 192.168.0.2. That's our database. And the port is the same. Password was set to root, and we can save the password if we like. Press save, and you can see that our database has come up for us. So this is a test DB. Now we don't have any data again. We're going to need to go through the process again. So in our schemas, you can see that our tables, we don't have any tables. So let's just go ahead and do that one more time with Django. So Django, or not Django admin, we can use that or manage Pi. Let's migrate again. There we go. And then we just go ahead and create a super user again. Okay. So let's go back into pgAdmin. So schema public tables. I'm going to refresh that. So I've got some tables now. And let's just go back into here. And then we go to view edit all rows. And now we can see the data that we have. So we can feel comfortable now. I won't go through this. You can if you like. If you don't feel comfortable with this, you can now go ahead and delete these containers, bring them up again, and all the data will persist, and you'll be exactly where you are now if you were to delete these here. So there we have a baseline Docker setup with PostgreSQL and pgAdmin. So although this is really a get started with Docker, PostgreSQL and pgAdmin, there are a few different options now to consider. So this obviously depends on how you want to set up your environment. Maybe you do just have one Docker setup for Postgres and pgAdmin, and you're going to utilize that with multiple Django applications. So here you need to think about where are you going to persist that data should your container fail or get deleted. Now, with Docker, we can back up containers, so we can build backups for our containers. We could use different types of volumes to persist our data. And in addition to that, obviously we've got the traditional approach of just making backups of our database so that we can then go ahead and maybe create our database on any Postgres database. So it's well worth thinking ahead if you are going to use this type of setup, exactly how you're going to ensure your data is backed up efficiently and effectively should a problem occur. No doubt at some point we'll go through that or create a tutorial which will cover some of those different aspects. But for now, hopefully this was useful, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.